So today we're going to be going through the different types of weld symbols and how to perform them when we're actually using pieces of metal. Yesterday we went through the different symbols and what they can tell us, as well as what to look for on the top and the bottom of the reference line. And we also learned different types of numbers while on the reference line. So now we're going to go through your sheet and we are going to interpret different weld symbols and we are going to line them up so you can see what they mean. The first weld symbol we are going to be doing is this one. The first thing we see is that there's two lines on the top and the bottom, which means that we will be performing the weld on both the arrow side and opposite side. Now the two lines mean that we're going to be doing a groove weld. When we do groove welds, we want to make sure that the metal is not touching completely, so we completely penetrate through both sides of the metal. But we also don't want to make sure it's too far because then they can bow out with the heat. So we're going to put our two pieces of metal together and create a little bit of a gap. And because we're welding on both sides, we're going to tack the top part and then we're going to tack the bottom. And then we will complete our weld and completely go all the way across. And once we do that on one side, we also have the other side to do because we are performing it on both sides. And so we will flip it over and do the same exact thing on the opposite side.
In simple terms, this weld symbol tells us that we need to perform a groove weld on both sides of our metal.
Next, we'll be moving on to weld symbol number 2. The first thing we notice is that the symbol is on the bottom of the reference line, which tells us that we will be performing the weld on the arrow side. Secondly, we see that there is a triangle, which tells us that we will be performing a fillet weld. So we have our two pieces of base metal, and when we perform a fillet weld, we want to make sure it is in a complete T-joint. Now, because the arrow is pointing up, it means that we will be performing our fillet weld at the overhead position. Therefore, when we perform our weld, we would perform it and line it up along this side because that is the one that the arrow is pointing to.
On your worksheet, you should have been writing down something along the lines of performing a fillet weld on the arrow side in the overhead position.
Now we will look at weld symbol number 3 on your worksheet. So when we're looking at it, the first thing that we can see is that through the tail, it has the SMAW, which means we will use the shielded metal arc welding process or stick welding. The next thing we see is that there is symbols on both sides of the reference line, which tells us that we will be performing a weld on both sides of the metal. We see that there is a triangle, which means we will be setting up our base metal in the fillet weld position, which means like this. We see that there is a 1/4 and a 3/16 gauge on both sides, which means when we perform our weld, that it should not exceed 1/4 or 3/16 of an inch when we perform our weld. Because the 3/16 is on the bottom, it means we will be performing that on the arrow side, which would be pointing right here. And since the 1/4 is on the top, we're going to be performing the 1/4 on the other side of the metal. Now there is a number in front of the triangle, which means we will be performing for the weld for 4 inches on each side. To get perfect measurements, we can use a speed square and measure 4 inches on both sides of our metal and mark it with soapstone.
You could describe this weld by saying that we would use the shielded metal arc welding process in performing a 4-inch fillet weld with a 3/16 inch leg on the arrow side and performing a 4-inch fillet weld with a 1/4 of an inch leg on the opposite side.
We're moving on to weld symbol number 4. So the first thing we see is that the symbol is on the top of the reference line, which means that we will be performing the weld on the other side. The box tells us that we are either going to be doing a plug or a slot weld. So a plug would be a tiny hole, and then a slot would be like a slot in the metal. So what we're going to do is a plug weld. We're basically just plugging the hole on top of the metal.
On your worksheet, you should have written something down along the lines of performing a plug or slot weld on the opposite side of the metal.
So the last weld symbol that we will be reading is weld symbol number 5, and we will also be performing this one at the end of class. So the first thing we see is that all of the symbols are on the top of the reference line, which means we will be performing the weld on the opposite side. The next thing we see is that there's a triangle, which means we will be performing a fillet weld, which means we will have 2 pieces of metal in a T position. Now, because the arrow and everything is on the top of the reference line, we will be performing the weld on the opposite side of the arrow. The 1/4 measurement tells us that we will be performing a weld with a 1/14 inch leg. The 2 shows us that we will be performing 2 welds on the plate, and the 4 tells us that we need to space the welds 4 inches apart. When performing our weld, we want to make sure that we have everything measured and marked correctly. We have our piece of base metal, and we also have our other piece of base metal that will be the top to our T. We will not be performing a weld on the arrow side since there is nothing below the reference line. We will be performing all of our welds on the opposite side of the arrow. So the 2-4 told us that we need to perform 2 welds spaced 4 inches apart. So we can take our speed square and we can measure out how long our base metal is. So the base metal we have today is going to be 6 inches, which means we need 2 inches spaced 4 inches apart. Since we have 6 inches of base metal, we can subtract the 4, which tells us that each of the welds need to be 1 inch each. So when we use our speed square, we can take our soapstone and mark at the 1 and at the 5 marking on our speed square. So after marking, it tells us that we need to perform welds on this side of the marking as well as this side of the marking. Before performing our welds, we need to ensure that we are properly suited up with all of our proper PPE, starting off with our Z87 rated safety glasses to protect our eyes. If you have long hair, you need to make sure that your hair is tied back. We need a long sleeve 100% cotton shirt or a welding jacket to put over. We need long denim pants to protect our legs, and they need to cover all the way down to your ankle. We need leather shoes or boots. We also need a welding helmet to protect our eyes when we weld, and leather gloves to protect our hands from hot metal. So we have already measured our base metal with our speed square and our soapstone to tell us where we need to perform our welds. So remember, we need to tack on each side and then perform our welds on the opposite sides of the metal. It asks us to do 2 welds spaced 4 inches, so we need to leave the middle open. So remember to always say cover before you start welding so everyone around you can cover their eyes and protect themselves from any bright light. Cover. So we just tacked one side of our weld. Now we can move our metal and perform the other side. Cover. So now we have performed both sides of tacking our metal, and now we can perform our 1-inch welds on each side. So now we're going to perform our welds on both sides of the lines. Cover. So we performed our weld on one side of the metal. Now we need to perform it on the other side. Cover. Once we have performed our welds, we can quench them in our bucket. So by reading our weld symbol, we were able to perform a weld in the fillet position. Each of our welds are 1/4 of an inch wide. We did 2 welds that were 1 inch each, and they were both spaced 4 inches apart.